Klunatics. It's me, Kurt Graves. Remember? From the podcast? Anyway, this isn't an official episode of the podcast. The producers and I are taking some time to work on future episodes, but I didn't want to leave you high and dry in the meantime, so today I'm sharing with you a few bits and pieces from interviews I've done that didn't make it into the final episodes we've produced so far. These are presented to you with minimal editing, so you'll get a chance to hear what it's like when an interviewee and I just get to talking. Up first is a conversation I had with TJ about his favorite Cluniverse couple that then became about what content is and isn't appropriate for certain books. I thought it was interesting to get this glimpse into how TJ is evolving as a writer, not just in his craft, but also in his potential audience. Here we go. So, who is your favorite romantic pair in all of your writing?
That sounds like picking a favorite child. And although if I were a parent, I could probably do that and not feel bad about it, really. I don't know if I could I could fall back on saying Gus and Casey just because I love that book so much and I love Gustavo Tiberius so much. But honestly, if I had to give it up for one pairing out of everything that I've written, it's probably going to be Sam of Wilds and Ryan Foxhart from The Lightning Struck Heart, because that book was something that I needed to write. At the time when that book was written, I had not written anything in a long time, and I was sad and upset and depressed, and everything sucked. So when I sat down to write The Lightning Struck Heart, I remember it was in the fall of 2014. And I decided to say, hey, I'm just going to write something that's the craziest and stupidest thing I've ever written. So I sat down, and not having written anything in like close to 6-7 months, I sat down one day and wrote 15,000 words in one day on that book. And it was something that I needed. It was necessary for me, and I needed a reason to smile, and that book gave me a reason to smile again. And I am eternally grateful for the opportunities that series has afforded me, and Ryan and Sam are at the forefront of that. And it's the reason why I wrote 3 more books in that series after that. It was just because I loved that world and them so much that I wanted to stay in it as long as possible. And of course, I got sick of them by the time that I wrote The Destiny of Dragons and Consumption of Magic and A Wish Upon the Stars back to back to back. That was almost 500,000 words that I wrote in the space of 8 months. And so I got so sick of them by the very end that I said, if I'm going to go back to that, it's going to be a long, long time in the future. And now here we are in the future, and I've started writing in that world again.
And how appropriate that would be your favorite, because in this story, they are actually shipped.
Right. Like, exactly. And it's something that I'm having fun with, going back and playing around in that world again, even though I'm a bit rusty. I've grown as a writer in the last few years, and I've had to tell myself not to be so stiff and to allow myself to not be as PC as I normally am with things that I write, because those books are offensive. They're offensive to some people. And I don't want to say that's okay, but that's not something that I necessarily feel too bad about, because it's not meant to be taken super seriously. And I've gotten some responses from people that weren't happy with some of the things that I said and did in those books, but I own it. Those are my books. And while anything that I write may not be, something that I always agree with or that I hold in my own beliefs, I still think that people sometimes take things too seriously. And I have started doing the same, especially since I started going into the whole YA realm. And something that I remember I wrote, I can't remember what the exact line was, but I wrote something that I thought was funny. It was just a stupid aside joke. And the sensitivity reader from Tor said, "Oh, you can't say stuff like that." And I said, "Oh, okay, I won't." And then I remember I wrote that something like, "Oh, even a blind man could see that." and they said that that's offensive to blind people. So I had to take that out. And I said, oh, okay. I guess I don't want to offend an entire community of blind people. So we'll take that out. And there's just all these little things that people could potentially find at one point maybe offensive that everybody wants to be prepared for. And I understand that. I get that. I get that we are a place where we have to be careful. But at the same time, I also am like, but do we really have to be that strict about every single little thing? No matter what you do, somebody's always going to be offended by something. And I have to try to find the line that I can walk with being true to what I want to write, but also not wanting to offend entire groups of people. And unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know, either way, the Tales from Verania series is not for the faint of heart, I guess you could say. Like, I remember somebody said that they had never read any of my books before, and they were wondering whether they should start with Into This River I Drown or The Lightning Struck Heart. And I said, no, you have to work up to both those books. You can't just jump in head first to Into This River I Drown, which is like the angstiest thing ever written, or The Lightning Struck Heart, which is like one of the most offensive things ever written. You kind of have to work your way up to those things with me if you're going to want to read my books.
It makes me think of when I work with my forensic students, sometimes a piece will have a swear word in it. And it's always their decision ultimately, but it's always like, well, do you want to take the chance that because of this one word, the rest of the work that you do in the piece gets discounted because somebody was offended by one word?
Right.
And, now that you are going to be a huge commercial success and there's tons of people working to promote your books, I guess it makes sense that they would want to make sure that there's no obstacles for potential readers.
Right.
Don't give them a reason.
Somebody's going to read the sweet, nice kindness of The House in the Cerulean Sea and be like, oh, I wonder what else he's written. And then they're going to read the Tales from Verania series and be like, okay. That's why now on my website, on each of the book pages, I have age ranges for what the books are good for. And The Lightning Struck Heart specifically says, do not read this if you're under the age of 18, even though I would read it if I was under the age of 18, but at the same time, I kind of have to protect myself because I don't want some parent picking up the Extraordinaries, the YA book for their child who's like 14, 15, and then all of a sudden they're like, oh, well, this sounds like a fun fantasy series. Let's get them the entire Lightning Struck Heart, and then warping their child's fragile little mind when there's scenes of dragons rimming unicorns and screaming the main character's name as a safe word. I don't want to add to the corruption of youth.
Don't you though?
Well, I mean, in a professional capacity as an author who is being published by a really big publisher, no, I do not. But as TJ Klune, with the little devil on my shoulder, yeah, fuck the children.
Oh,
yeah,
that's why I like you. My conversation with TJ segues nicely into part of producer Angela's introduction that didn't fit anywhere else in the podcast. Angela lives just a few hours away from me, so she came to my house and we recorded hours of interviews, which is why she has and will continue to pop up in several episodes throughout the season. Here she is talking about The Lightning Struck Heart, which, reminder, TJ just said parents should not give to their children.
The first book really spoke to my grief, and that book to me really does kind of a total wish fulfillment. When you're grieving, he takes you through all of it and he takes you out the other side better than you started. And I was in a really, really dark place when The Lightning Struck Heart came out. And I read it all at once in bed. I hadn't been out of bed in probably a week. And I laughed through that first chapter. And I remember thinking to myself, I've read thousands and thousands of books, since middle school, clock about a book a day. Not Mia level of reading. I don't know if anybody else is, but half Mia, something like that. And I thought, I don't think I've ever read a book where I just laughed continuously through the whole first chapter. And I got up out of bed and I walked across the room to my daughter's room, who was, I think she was maybe 17, 18. And I knocked on her door and I asked her to give me her phone. And she gave me her phone. And I immediately pulled it up and downloaded it, bought it again for her phone and gave it to her. And because in my irrational moment, I just thought, if I get hit by a truck tomorrow, if she has this book, she's going to be okay. Like, I really felt that way. Like, that's how life-saving that book felt to me in that moment. And then later I realized that I'd given my daughter, a book about unicorn and dragon, BDSM, sex in the woods. And then I still stood by it. I was like, all right, no, still, I'm standing by this decision.
Some of my favorite conversations with Klunatics have been with parents. Although if you ask the producers, I basically go into our group chat and say every interview I do is my new favorite, so take that with a grain of salt. But I've loved talking to these parents who share with me how reading TJ's work has changed their worldview and helped them connect with their kids. And Zorn and I got to talking about her kid, and I wanted to share that conversation with you guys because it's actually very reassuring. I relate to that so much, having grown up gay at a time when that transition was just starting to happen, where you were starting to see some representation of gay characters like in media and television, and how much that made it easier for people in my real life to understand who I was.
Yeah, there's something about getting inside the head of a character that helps so much more with your understanding than just reading a definition. Here's what it is. That doesn't penetrate as much as being able to go through all the thoughts in this character's head and experience it with them. Yeah.
Because you can't always know somebody personally who can teach you those lessons, but we do feel like we know characters in books. Like
Definitely.
They become our friends and they can teach us things.
Yeah.
I mean, you covered like all the stuff I want to talk about, so like a pro. So how many kids do you have? Is it just the one? Just one? Okay.
Yep. Unless you count the dog.
Well, I know some people do. I am not I like dogs. We don't have one, so you won't catch me calling anything a fur baby quite yet. So did the reading of male romance in general, or TJ's work specifically, help you when your kid started using, gender neutral pronouns?
Oh, yes. And it's their understanding of themselves has evolved in sort of the same way, thankfully, hopefully with not the negative connotations that I started out with, but they have identified different ways over the past few years, and that's where we are right now, is with non-binary. But they are a big fan of romance as well, and a very prolific writer of work and fan fiction, and nipping to follow at TJ's heels someday, I'm pretty sure.
Oh, that's awesome.
So yeah, they have devoured as many books as I would allow them to read. And we've done some other TJ books as our family books as well. We did The Bones Beneath My Skin, and we did Movie Star, although I had to edit just a little bit because it was the Kirt story was a little beyond what my then 13-year-old was probably okay with, especially since they wanted to voice Kirt, because Kirt was another character of TJ's that was really helpful to them because they have general anxiety disorder and OCD, and seeing a character that had anxiety and spoke openly about it and how it felt and what it meant was amazing to them.
It's amazing how intersectional TJ's characters are. They're not only queer, they're not only non-binary, but then he also talks about mental health, and he talks about all of these other things that so many of us are dealing with on a daily basis, but we just don't get to see it or hear about it. And again, it's like the way that characters can normalize that. Characters in books can normalize that for us in a way that, is so soothing. So
yes, wow. Very healing, I think.
What I gotta ask, what is life like for a non-binary kid in Kentucky in 2020?
It depends on where we are. We are in Louisville, which is a blue island in a sea of red. So Louisville is very accepting in general. Most of the people are very accepting, and most of the laws and ordinances and stuff are good, but there's a lot of pockets of prejudice, and they are not out as non-binary to everyone in our lives, especially in the homeschool community. There's a decent sized secular homeschool community around here, but there's an even larger sized religious homeschool community, and we have to be a little careful about, but the people that we know personally that are in that category of the very religious have not been bad. There's not been any negative. There's been some, I don't really believe that, but you do you, or I don't really think that's a thing, but I love you anyway, kind of thing. So that's good. That's the best we can hope for. And they're not out to one of their grandparents, because that would not be a good thing. But
at your own time, in your own place, and when it feels safe, like that is
exactly.
Yeah, that's the key.
They're out to a lot of the people that we're around, and for the most part, very supportive. That could be the groups that we seek out tend to be very supportive too. But
good. I'm glad to hear that. And I hope that it's the stereotype, of course, is the American South is not as accepting, but of course there are pockets of accepting people everywhere. And I would hope that really, again, once you know somebody and you already love them, there's a lot that you can, that can be the thing that opens your mind. And you may struggle with it, and I totally understand that. I lived through that myself, that there's people who just need to take some time and then they come around. So that's good. I'm glad to hear that. The interviews I did for the episode about characters of color were so educational for me. And there was so much good stuff we didn't even include. So one of the best bits was this exchange I had with Doc.
Yeah, the other thing that I wanted to mention with a lot of TJ's characters of color is that they're biracial. I am multiracial. In this country, I am Black. I was born in Canada. My parents are from the Caribbean and from West Africa, and their parents are from the Middle East and India. And I have a great grandmother who's Spanish. Only in America are you identified by your race. In places where I have lived and traveled. Everywhere else, you're identified by your ethnicity. So go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, part of my role in this podcast is to ask the stupid questions just to make sure we're being super clear. Can you explain what the difference is between race and ethnicity?
So for me, race is about color, especially how we define it in America. So I see a person who is brown, and there are white people, for folks who have met me, there are white people darker than me. But I'm identified as Black because of my skin tone and my features, my facial features, and my body type. When I say ethnicity, I'm talking about the culture, the food, the music, the language that you grow up in. And so even though Canada is also a melting pot, in Canada, I would identify more strongly with my Caribbean and West African roots as a Trinidadian and as a Sierra Leonean. And that's how I grew up. I moved here when I was in elementary school. I moved to the States. And that's when I realized that, I'm Black. Not that I didn't know the color of my skin, but there is this otherness. And it's another reason why I like that he uses the word Black and not African American, because not all who are Black are African American. And whether I don't know that that's intentional for him, but for those of us who are in the diaspora, and when I say diaspora, meaning people who have origins in folks who were enslaved and transported all over the world, are Black, but they may not be African American and have an African American experience. Yeah. And that's a whole other podcast. Yeah.
Finally, I want to end on a happy note, and who doesn't love hearing people say nice things about them? So here's some of my conversation with Michael Leslie and Greg Tremblay, in which we talk about you guys.
So I was introduced to the Klunatics Facebook group by TJ after, I don't know, it was somewhere down the line. And it's like it's a combination of being introduced to that group and GRL as an experience that it is so gratifying to talk to people face to face and for people to talk about how, sometimes I perceive this job as not being important, and then I can rationalize its importance by people that have like jobs that I view as important, talking about the experience of our books relieving them, from stress or bringing joy to their lives. It is like a truly legitimate, it just brings me a lot of happiness to get that kind of feedback. And it really resonates for when, like what Greg was saying about not performing for the authors, performing for the fans. I think often about like specific Klunatics when I'm doing a TJ Klune book and how they will specifically react to a line delivery, for instance. And yeah, it really like puts a lot of energy into my motivation to do well. Especially if we're doing a fixed rate, which is more often than not how we're doing it. It's like when it comes down to it, we're on the clock. And so any like extra work that you're really putting forward, that's up to you. That's like extra credit. I know this sounds so like economically driven, but like the hard brass facts, like sometimes it kind of is. I really feel good about putting in that extra effort sometimes just for the pure desire to impress, to like catch someone off guard. I really like subverting, for instance, some line deliveries. Like I feel like jokes can be made out of line deliveries that weren't expected to be funny, suddenly changing because you've toyed with it so much, and suddenly you've like found something that's new and there. I don't know. And I really look forward to my interactions with people. And the Klunatics Facebook page has been like, if it wasn't for that, there's no way I'd be on Facebook. It is like the only crucial thing about that site. And it is such a good community. Like people are so supportive and kind and it's like, it's not just cheerleading. It's very thoughtful. And it's like, especially for the toxic environs that is Facebook, it is like a true oasis. And so, yeah. Yeah, I don't know, Greg, if you're like in it, but you should join up. I mean, it's a great group.
I am honestly on Facebook very little.
Good for you, man.
Yeah, I mean, I'm there, but I for the most part, Facebook for me is a little bit of, I don't know. It's
sort of a work thing, right?
I mean, it's a little bit of a work thing. I do honestly the majority of time that I spend on Facebook, I spend in a sailing and cruising forum. So it's less
and he
about
means
work
boats,
and a little
guys.
bit. I do
He's
mean
talking
boats.
about
Yes,
boats.
I
yeah.
mean boats. Yes, I always have to
the dark side of Facebook. Yeah, it's the marketplace, man.
Right. Yeah. It's it's a thumbs up means a whole different thing.
Liked.
I totally relate to what you're saying, Michael, about just like the Klunatics fans being a great motivator for getting work done. And I mean, it's not always the case. Like I love TJ's work for TJ's work, but sometimes it's also just fun to think about like, oh, I can't wait for somebody to hear this, because you'll get that feedback eventually. I mean, it's why over the last month, you and I and Derek just like recorded a free short story that we put out in this podcast feed purely for fun. You may have done it because I pressured you into it, but I did it purely for fun. Just because I thought how much fun it would be to see the Klunatics react to it. And you know what? It was a joy to see.
No, it was awesome, man. That was so cool. I felt a combination, I would say, of pressure and for fun, but you did such a good job with it. It was just like, I'm so glad that I was a part of it.
Thank you so much for continuing to listen to the podcast, guys. We're so grateful for everyone who shares their feedback with us and the people we see sharing the podcast online or recommending it to their friends. We're so, so grateful. We will be back next week with a brand new episode. Can't wait to share that with you. Mwah.